Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am Dr. Claudia Albers, Planet X researcher and professional physicist. And today I'd like to bring to you another one of my articles. This one is entitled The Continuous Big Bang. Now, according to the astronomer Halton Arp, quasars are not extremely bright objects at the edge of the universe, but very young galaxies just starting to develop the galactic arms that characterize most galaxies. And in his book Seeing Red, Halton Arp shows that the redshift that astrophysicists use to determine the distance of objects in the universe to Earth cannot be used to determine distance, as most of the measured redshift of these objects is intrinsic in nature. He shows this by displaying many images of objects of high redshift clearly connected by dust to low redshift objects. And we see here one of the images from his book, and we see a large galaxy of low redshift connected to a small galaxy of high redshift. And it's connected by this dust. As you can see, the two galaxies clearly connected. Now, the larger galaxy, if we interpret its redshift as recessional velocity, it would be equivalent to a speed of 8,700 kilometers per second. So this would be how fast this galaxy would be moving away from Earth. Whilst the smaller one would have a recessional velocity, if we interpret redshift as recessional velocity, of 17,000 kilometers per second. So this one would be moving twice as fast. And these speeds are usually interpreted as distance. So this would mean that this galaxy would be twice as far away from Earth as this galaxy, because the speeds are that 17,000 is nearly twice as much as 8,700. So this would mean that this galaxy would have to be, the larger one with the lower redshift would have to be much closer to Earth than the smaller one with a much higher redshift. But because they are connected by dust, they have to be in the same place and therefore at the same distance. And this shows that redshift cannot be interpreted as distance. And this in turn falsifies the Hubble law, which states that speed is directly proportional to distance, and therefore the Big Bang model. Now, according to Big Bang theorists and all astronomers, astrophysicists, and cosmologists who subscribe to the theory, redshift is, as I said, due to recessional velocity. In other words, it is related to how fast an object such as a galaxy is moving away from Earth. And Hubble showed that objects with higher redshift were further away, although he could only do this for a few objects that were not extremely far away. But it became a law called the Hubble law. This would then mean that all galaxies are moving away from Earth in every direction, so the universe would have to be expanding. In addition, since light travels at a constant speed, when we look at objects that are further away from Earth, then we are looking back in time. And if these objects are moving faster than objects that are nearer, this means that the universe had expanded faster in the past. This then suggests that the universe exploded, expanding very fast initially and then slowing down as time passed. And this is the essence of the Big Bang theory. But as I explained, it all fails because we cannot interpret recessional velocity in terms of speed and therefore in terms of distance. So the whole theory fails, and the fact that the universe is expanding fails as well. Now, Halton Arp suggested on the basis of his observations that redshift is an actual intrinsic property of matter, which has to do with the age of that matter. The younger the matter, the higher will be its intrinsic redshift. Thus, quasars have higher redshift because they are younger than galaxies with lower redshift. He also showed that quasars condense from matter being ejected from older galaxies with extremely bright nuclei. These extremely bright galaxies are called active galactic nuclei galaxies. And it has been known since 1948 that galaxies eject material from their nuclei. One example of this typical ejection can be seen in the galaxy Cygnus A, which we see here below. And this galaxy emits high energy radio wave emitting material from its nucleus. There's its nucleus, there's the material. The ejections are in opposite directions. And the matter ejected from active galactic nuclei initially moves close to the speed of light, but slows down in the course of time and as it acquires mass. Thus, a very bright galaxy seems to be creating matter and ejecting it in opposite directions along the minor axis. And this is illustrated here. So we see a galaxy, and these matter is ejected extremely fast at first, which shows that matter was accelerated to extreme speeds as it got ejected, and then it condenses, it forms quasars. And this matter ejection occurs along the axis of rotation of the galaxy, which is called its minor axis. This means that instead of one creation event 13 billion years ago, as suggested by the Big Bang model, we have continuous matter creation occurring all over the universe. But what is causing this matter creation? Now, as detailed in Article 168 entitled Electric Sun and Toroidal Envelopes, stars are electrical objects which work by establishing a potential difference between their center and their outer edge. Stars do this by separating their overall charge so that the interior is positive and their outside layer the inner corona is negative. Stars do this by moving electrons towards their outer edge. And we can see here an illustration of what a star would look like. The interior is positive at the center, and electrons for the matter that makes up the interior is separated from the interior and moves to the edge, so that the edge, the corona of the star, which is the gaseous atmosphere of a star, becomes negatively charged because there is an excess of electrons in this layer, and there's an excess of ions, positive material on the inside. This would be the photosphere. This is when most of the light is being emitted. This would be the chromosphere, which is a transition between the photosphere and the outer corona, the inner corona, which is the outer layer of the atmosphere of the star. Now, what happens is, because there is this separation of charge, we get electric discharges, and these electric discharges enable the acceleration of matter, the fusion of matter, and the creation of matter. And each creation of matter event uses up some of the potential difference that the star has. And this potential arises from the formation of the star, the event that led to the formation of the star, and where the matter that the star is made of was created. That's the event that created that matter that then condensed into a star. So whatever happens with galaxies happens with stars. Galaxies are created by matter creation events which condense into quasars, and stars are created by matter creation events which condense into stars. Now, the phenomena of separation of charge is inherent in the universe, as all matter is formed out of atoms, and the structure of atoms is based on charge separation. An atom has protons in the nucleus, which are positively charged, and electrons outside the nucleus, which are negatively charged. In this way, the sun, and by extension all stars, and I must include all galaxies, are superatoms. Stars have positive interiors and negative exteriors, just like atoms. It is the separation of charge which allows stars to continuously eject mostly ions and form positively charged rings and nebula clouds around themselves, and thus create a capacitor with the star at the center, and its inner corona as the negative plate in this capacitor. All celestial objects seem to exhibit this inherent property, as all planets and even all man-made objects quickly acquire negative outside charge in outer space. The charge does not, in this case, come from the environment the object is in, but from inside the object itself. Thus, electrons will flow from atoms making up the object until the correct potential difference is established between the core and the outer edge of the object. And we see here the capacitor, the illustration, the capacitor that stars form. The star in the center itself is a superatom, in that it has a positive center and a negative charge on the outside. And this atom is what produces the star's ability generation to generate this capacitor around it, where positive ions are ejected from the star, and as a result of discharges, electric discharges, which are powered by this charge separation inside the star. And this means that ions are being ejected outwards. They then accumulate along rings, along along these equipotential surfaces. So these surfaces that all have the same potential have a certain concentration of ions. The rings that form closest to the star have heavier ions, and the lighter ions end up going right out to the outer nebular ring or surface of the star. So we would have hydrogen up to sulfur in the outer ring, which for the sun is beyond Pluto. And as we get closer, we will get an inner ring that will have iron, nickel, and heavier nuclei like that. And then what happens is a comet, when it comes in, can be charged in this capacitor by moving across equipotential surfaces. And then the star and the capacitor reacts by charging it. So in other words, making it have the same potential as its environment by discharging, that is, producing a current of electrons from the outer layer of the star, which is the corona. These would be electrons moving outwards, and then positive ions moving from the outer nebular clouds. These would create the tail, and there sometimes we can see the current of electrons produces a spike on the comet. This is explained in previous articles I have written. Now, photons with high enough energy split into a particle-antiparticle pair. In other words, a gamma ray may split into a proton-antiproton pair. And since the two particles have opposite charge, we again see that charge separation is occurring. And in addition, this suggests that a photon is actually made up of two particles. The photon splits into its two constituent particles, most likely as a result of it moving through an electric potential difference or through an electric field. Electric potential differences occur as a result of electric fields, which are always perpendicular to the equipotential surfaces. But an electric field will pull particles which are oppositely charged in opposite directions. It thus seems that a photon may split into two constituent particles when it moves through an electric field. So this is what happens with a photon. A gamma ray is known to split into a proton and antiproton pair, and these are oppositely charged particles. Now, protons are known to split, as I said. These can combine back into a photon, but they do not annihilate or cease to exist. In other words, what I'm saying is there's no such thing as antimatter. There's only matter. These particles both have mass. There's no such thing as antimass. And they are oppositely charged. And they can combine if the electric field leading to them separating either is not large enough for them to maintain the separation, or they move quickly into an area where there's no electric field. And here's an illustration of what an electric field will look like inside the solar capacitor. It's always perpendicular to the equipotential surface, which we see here. So it forms lines moving inwards towards the sun, because electric fields always are oriented, so the arrow points towards the negative charge and moves outwards from the positive charge. And the nebula clouds are the positive plates in the solar capacitor, whilst the sun's inner corona is the negative plate. So now charges, if we have a positively charged particle, it will move in the same direction as the arrows indicating the orientation of the electric field. So positive charge will always move towards the negative plate, and a negative charge moves in the opposite direction, in other words, always towards the positive plate. So a photon, which is made up of two oppositely charged particles, if it's moving through a region of electric field, which is pointing this way, so this would be the inner surface of the capacitor, or the inner corona of a star, or it could be a galaxy. Galaxies are basically the same. They will have an outer layer of negative charge. Then what happens is this the photon separates into its constituent particles, but in this case it's a proton and an electron. The proton is positively charged and the electron is negatively charged. So this leads to matter creation. That's where matter comes from inside the photon. Now, the fact that matter which condenses into quasars starts out being created in episodic matter creation events emanating from extremely bright galactic nuclei suggests that the emission of bright light is related to matter creation events. The intensity of the light is most likely due to a very high electric field or a very high potential difference in the nucleus of such galaxies, which results in the emission of photons, which are then split into their constituent particles due to the influence of the strong electric field. In other words, this would be the galactic nucleus, and at the top of the galactic nucleus, what we have is a discharge, an intense electric discharge, which greatly accelerates the matter that is ejected from the center. There would be some kind of matter ejection, which would result into the discharge. It's like a flare. In other words, it leads to intense light emission. And this intense light emission, as a result of the discharge, which creates an intense electric field, causes the light that comes from this intense flare to separate into constituent particles. And therefore, light now becomes matter, newly created matter. So the intensity of the light is most likely due to a very high electric field or a very high potential difference in the nucleus of these galaxies, and this causes the emission of these photons, which then split into their constituent particles due to the influence of this very strong electric field. This event is much like what occurs on the sun when it releases a solar flare, which can be described as larger than a normal lightning discharge. But for a galaxy, such a discharge will be at a larger scale and create an extremely strong electric field in the discharge area. This therefore suggests that not all photons of the same frequency are necessarily alike, as they may be made of different sets of particles. In addition, since photons have zero mass and their constituent particles have non-zero mass, this indicates that mass manifests as a result of photons moving through a strong enough electric field when photons split into their constituent particles. So what we have is a very strong electric field generated by the electric discharge itself and the creation of photons, because whenever there is an acceleration of charged particles, there is emission of light. But this light will now be moving through an intense electric field, and this will mean that the photons will split into their constituent particles. Once protons and electrons appear, then some protons and electrons may combine to produce neutrons. After that fusion may occur, giving rise to heavier nuclei, after which electrons may be captured and neutral atoms may form. When neutral atoms start to form, photons will be given off, and thus the matter will become visible. So what we see here, we have the newly created protons and electrons that have been separated by the electric field that was generated during this creation of matter event. Some of the electrons and protons may combine, but not into a photon again, but a neutron. And this object will have mass. It will not be like the photon, which has zero mass. And then protons and electrons will also combine to form neutral atoms. Fusion will occur to give rise to heavier nuclei, which then may capture electrons as well and appear in their neutral form. When electrons are captured, photons are given off. Now, the fact that electrons will form atoms indicate that there is a force which appears from within photons. As the two massive and oppositely charged particles appear, that forces opposite charges to separate and remain separate. In other words, the potential difference going into splitting the photon into constituent particles becomes a permanent charge separating force, which manifests at the microscopic and macroscopic level. This force manifests microscopically as atoms form, and macroscopically so that the condensing object and it has an inherent overall tendency to separate charge, so that its center is positive and its outer edge negative. Now, all atoms will produce quantized charge separation levels. In other words, only certain potential differences are allowed for each kind of atom. It is likely that the macroscopic objects, stars, planets, galaxies, will do the same, and only certain electrical potential differences are allowed. So what we have here is what happens on the microscopic level, that is, atoms forming with electrons only at certain separations, which leads only certain electric potentials, because it depends on how far these are. And then the same thing happens macroscopically, that is, with the galactic nucleus. You have a certain separation of positive and negative, and these are possibly quantized, that is, only certain separations are allowed, and separations in between those do not happen. And a quasar, which is just a small galaxy, will have the same thing. Only certain separations allowed, only certain electric potentials allowed, and most likely the same thing will happen with stars as well. Now, as matter forms and electrons are captured, more photons will be given off, and these photons will experience the electric field set up in the forming quasar. This field is generated by the separation of charge. Now, this field would most likely not be as strong as the one that led to the two original split of photons into particles, but still be strong enough to cause a little separation, which should decrease the photon's energy and thus its wavelength. And that means its wavelength will become elongated, leading to the redshift phenomena. So that means that if we have a photon which has constituent particles, proton and electron, it's not moving through an electric field. Nothing happens to it. The fact that it's made up of these constituent particles is hidden, and mass does not manifest. Neither does charge, neither does any other of the forces that may spring out of these two separating. But the moment the photon moves through an electric field, the particles within it separate a little bit without separating completely. And when this happens, the energy of the photon decreases. In other words, its wavelength becomes longer. And in other words, the photon becomes redshifted. So this is where redshift comes from. So as the quasar ages and develops into a large galaxy, the potential difference between the center and the edge decreases in steps, and thus the redshift of the photons originating from its atoms as they capture electrons will also decrease. It is also likely that a step decrease results in a certain amount of energy being released as photons, which equal to a step decrease in that potential, which then results in a new galaxy being formed with that energy. Thus, the energy given off by the galaxy is given by, so the change in the galaxy in each matter creation event is equal to the initial energy of the quasar, which is equal to the total charge of the quasar times the potential difference, initial potential difference of the quasar. It will decrease as the quasar starts creating matter that condenses into stars, and eventually the quasar may start creating other galaxies as well. Now, so the initial energy is the initial energy of the quasar, and VOQ is the initial potential difference across the galaxy from the center to the edge of, in this case, it's the newly formed galaxy or the quasar. And Q is the total initial charge of the quasar. Now, this means that galaxies must use some of their driving and charge separation electric potential, which its matter acquired at formation, to create more matter. Thus, its electric potential difference will decrease with time, and so will its redshift. The galaxy's charge separation ability will also likely to decrease with each matter creation event. When a large amount is created in one huge event, it forms into a quasar, which becomes another galaxy. But galaxies will also continuously create matter in smaller events, and matter created in these small events are not accelerated enough to leave the parent galaxy, but form into stars which populate the galaxy. So, in conclusion, matter creation is occurring on a continuous basis in the universe. Active galaxies create other galaxies which start out as quasars, which also have very high redshifts. Galaxies continuously create matter which condenses into stars. Matter creation occurs when photons move through regions of very high electric field, which forces the photons' constituent particles to separate and the charge separation driving potential to appear. In this way, all matter and appearance of all celestial objects, from galaxies to stars, as well as all energy conversion mechanisms in the universe, spring forth from light, because that's what photons are. Photons are light. And here are the references. This is Dr. Claudia Albers, Planet X physicist. Thank you for watching.